Hello, everyone. My name is Leanne Kim, and on behalf of the Women's Museum of California, I would like to welcome you to this live conversation about an inspiring and intergenerational documentary called The Archivettes. This film is part of the museum's June film series that includes 2 additional films directed by phenomenal women. And how timely as we wrap up Pride Month to shine a light on the Lesbian Herstory Archives, home to the world's largest collection of materials by and about lesbians and their communities. In a mere 60 minutes, we are taken through a 40-year plus journey of the major milestones in LGBTQ plus history and incredible stories of how the archives has literally rescued history from the trash. We'd like to thank San Diego Pride, A Tour of Her Own, and Moxie Theater for supporting this film and conversation. And if you're joining us live, thank you so much. And hopefully you've seen the archives. If not, you will still enjoy this discussion, but we encourage you to please watch the film. You have until June 29th to do so through the Women's Museum of California's website. We'll provide a link in the chat for you. Speaking of which, we invite all of you to engage with us by sharing your thoughts in our chat throughout this discussion, and we will do our best to address any of your questions. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce our 2 panelists for this evening. I am so thrilled to welcome Archivettes director Megan Rossman. She's an award-winning documentary filmmaker, journalist, and assistant professor of communication at Purchase College. Her film, Love Letter Rescue Squad, won Best Student Documentary in the Emerging Filmmaker Showcase at the Cannes Film Festival, American Pavilion in 2017. Holla! And she's also worked as a multimedia journalist at the Washington Post. Megan joins us live from Manhattan. Megan, it's so great to see you.
Great to be here. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm looking forward to a great discussion.
And thank you. I know it's really late over there, but we'll try to keep you up because I'm full of energy right now and so excited for this discussion.
I can feel it.
Good, awesome. Our second guest is Dr. Cayleff, a longtime supporter of the Women's Museum of California. For decades, Cayleff has dedicated her life to civil rights, allyship, and as a women's studies professor at San Diego State University for more than 30 years. She has served as department chair. She helped launch SDSU's LGBTQ studies program, and she is a founding member of the university's Pride Center and Safe Zones program. Cayleff, we are so honored. Thank you for joining us live from Cape Cod tonight.
Thanks. It's really a pleasure to be part of this. Thank you.
Well, ladies, I'm so looking forward to this conversation. We will begin our discussion about the making of the film with Megan, and then Cayleff, I will bring you in a little later to share your thoughts and your perspectives as a lifelong activist and educator. So does that sound good?
Excellent.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll see you in a bit, Cayleff. And Megan, happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride. I'm so ready. I have all my plans for this weekend tomorrow.
I know.
Gets it started.
So it's all the festivities are happening this weekend in New York.
That's right. Yeah.
Awesome. And you know what? Congratulations on the film. I checked out your website and I literally counted the number of screenings. It's unbelievable. This film, The Archivettes, has screened at more than 60 film festivals worldwide, both virtually and in person. And it's garnered a number of awards. And you know, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's the only film that's ever been made exclusively about the Lesbian Herstory Archives, correct?
Yeah, it's the only film exclusively. There are a few other films that do mention the archive.
Well, that's crazy amazing. And given the invisibility of lesbians and the difficult story and telling your difficult history in telling your stories, are you surprised by the reaction? I mean, there's been such a tremendous outpouring of love for this film.
I'm so grateful. I really am. And I think that, you know, making this film was such an incredible experience to me. And I'm just so happy that other people feel that energy that I felt when I went into the archive and realized like how important it was, how much our history is disappearing, and the incredible work of this group of activists who literally rescued history from the trash.
And you have done such a great job in making us feel really connected with the Archivettes from the very, very beginning. And you did it in 60 minutes, which is really, really incredible. So I'm wondering, especially after this past year, how are the Archivettes doing? I hope that everyone survived and made it through the pandemic, because I really fell in love with every single person that I saw in your film.
Yes, we are super lucky that all the Archivettes survived the pandemic and are all doing well. I think, one key moment for me is when they started opening up vaccination appointments. I was checking in with them, like, do you know about this? Do you need help navigating the websites because it's so difficult? But they were able to, get in early, and thankfully everyone is healthy and they march forward. They actually are just starting to reopen their doors to researchers that have specific projects that need to get into the archive.
Okay, but they've still been closed, right, this entire time?
They've been closed the entire time. Literally just yesterday, I talked to someone and they're going to start taking research appointments soon.
Wow. Breaking news right here. Okay. Well, it's interesting that you were talking about like, I reached out to them about making their appointments. And it sounds like you're more than just a film director at this point. You spent many years with them because, with most directors, you have a little bit of distance from your subjects, but it sounds to me like you guys have all become family over those years.
Well, I think that when we think about the gay community, we often use that word family, right? Pointing someone out. And part of that is the culture of chosen family, because people were often rejected by their family and had to find that. And I think the archives has been an incredible place for chosen family. So many women have passed through there and felt that embrace. I certainly felt it even the moment that I walked through those doors, just with the kindness of Deb Edel and Maxine Wolf immediately even though they didn't know me, being willing to do an interview and talk to me. And I've just felt that, time and time again when I showed up at Joan Nessel's house in Australia to interview her. And it really felt like family, even though we had never met before. That connection is so strong. And I think it's really important because, as a young gay person, I always kind of thought the worst thing about, being gay. And it took me a little while to come out. But a big part of seeing the Archivettes age is like, hey, not only are they surviving, but they are thriving. And I think that has a lot of power in your life to see someone, to see your elders and to understand what they went through and what they pushed for and how that's impacted you.
Right. And it seems as though that by making this film, it's only made your life more full and more rich. This film in particular was several years in the making, but it actually started off as a short film, as we mentioned earlier. Can you tell us about that story?
Sure. So initially, honestly, I had a friend come visit me in my apartment, and she's using Google Maps and said, "What is the Lesbian Herstory Archives?" And I said, "I have no idea, but I should know. I'm a lesbian and I want to find this out." And so I reached out to them, and that's when Deb Edel and Maxine Wolf got back to me and said, "Oh, sure, we'd be up for doing an interview. That's fine." And the first time I walked in there, I just felt like I was coming home. I had never thought about lesbians like me from the past. I'd always thought about family history as like a bloodline history. So this really shifted that perspective. And basically I did these interviews and then I just kind of gradually filmed them. It was on the back burner. They did Brooklyn Pride. I went to film that. Maxine gave a tour. I went to film that. And then I was in graduate school at the time and had a class where we could do anything we wanted. And I thought like, oh, I'm finally going to edit this. I'm going to pull it together. And that's how the film came to be, the Love Letter Rescue Squad. And then when it premiered and did so well, I was like, oh my God, I'm not the only one who really cares about this. Like, audiences want to know about the Lesbian Herstory Archives.
And it's so great because they collect stories of other people, but they had yet to collect stories about themselves. So you really played an interesting role in archiving the archives for them.
Well, yeah, definitely. I think the thing that was so interesting is like, they kind of wanted someone to come along and do this at some point, but I was maybe like 20 years earlier than they thought, because a lot of the material I found was stuff that like clearly they were filming themselves and recording themselves, and they wanted to make sure that they left this behind. But I think it would surprise people when I would like come knocking and they're like, oh, I'm just retiring, or I haven't quite retired yet. And you have these like scandalous video of me like topless in the archive. And, you know, I was like, oh, wow. It was clear, like they definitely recorded it because they wanted someone to have it, but maybe it was just a little bit sooner than they had initially anticipated.
I love all their VHS recordings, you know, the ones where, you know, you can tell that the tape has been, you know, it's old and kind of scratchy, you know, and it has that nice kind of VHS theme. And then you have like the beautiful glossy shots, like the opening scene. Tell us about the opening scene, because I was really taken aback. It really connected me because it opened us up to the reality of one's mortality, and to choose that as your opening scene was interesting. Tell us about how that came about.
When I went out to make the film, that was the central question, right? How do I bring people into the archives? And so as a filmmaker, you always think about emotional connection and knowing that this place comes into a lot of people's lives when they've had loss and they're trying to figure out how to remember the person whom they lost. And I had let the Archivettes know, hi, I really would love to film a donation. And they were like, great. But often what happens is people just come by. We don't always get like a lot of notice. And so when Melissa, who's in the film, had called Colette, one of the Archivettes, texted me to let me know this person's coming tomorrow around this time. I'm sure they, you know, they'd be open to being filmed. So I came and I'm waiting. And we thought Melissa was going to be older because, you know, she's donating her partner's materials. And here comes this young woman that's like my age. Yeah. And we were both just so, you know, moved hearing from her, and that she was so willing to share. And I think for her also, she was so happy to be included because she just knew that that could be part of Ellie's legacy, that she can just continue to live on. And I think that's kind of what it's all about at the archive, is that idea of remembering the voices we've lost, and also, you know, ensuring that we're learning from our history so that we don't make the same mistakes or choices again and again.
Yeah. And what I love about opening your film with Melissa and Ellie's story is that there's this intergenerational theme that's throughout the film, right? And just like you said, we expect it to be somebody who's older, but they were younger. And we see throughout the film the connection between the younger generation and the older generation. Can you talk a little bit about that and how important that was to showcase in this film?
I think intergenerational nature is vital. I think for the archives, they've always had it. In the early days, they had Mabel Hampton, you know, who was much older than Joan, maybe 40 years older, hanging around and, you know, helping influence them and talk about her experiences. And, you know, from what I know, she used to kind of hold court, and people would love to talk to her and hear about like, oh, what was it like to be a lesbian during this time? Or how did you handle this? And I think that continues. And I also just think, in addition to understanding that like gay people live a full and long life, and there's a lot of joy and happiness and goodness, it also helps you have that appreciation and understanding. I certainly didn't know anything about lesbian history before I walked through those doors, right? And I've learned so much. But I would also say, you know, I was a graduate student. I was, you know, very interested. It just wasn't something that I had taken the time to kind of search out on my own. And once I started learning, I realized how much had been done and how much had happened to push us to the level of progress that we are today, where I can walk down the street holding hands with my partner, you know, and feel very comfortable and open.
Yeah. And there's a scene in there where we see volunteers sifting through donated personal items. And oh my gosh, every time they do, it's just so tender and so intimate. And they had two bins. One was like, what to include in the archives for exhibition, what not to include. And I would be like, oh my God, what do we include? What do we not include, right? And I wonder if there's some parallel, because you had 40 years of history to sift through, you know, and you shoehorned it into 60 minutes somehow. and you had to have your own two bids, right? What do I include in the film? What do I not include in the film? What was your process in making that selection?
Oh, it's so hard. And honestly, you could make so many films about the archive that would be, equally comprehensive. And I left a lot on the cutting room floor. A lot of people didn't end up being included. Certain issues weren't focused on as much. I think in terms of my process, what I tried to do is think about the people who had been there almost since the beginning, like Deb. Maxine hasn't been there since the beginning, but quite a long time. And I started by going through their special collections and just seeing what materials were in there. Looking at their photographs, their letters, cards, all of that stuff. And I knew that would be my starting point, is kind of using these women who had started the archive as a way to try to weave things together. And then I also thought about the different generations. So Polly Thistlethwaite loves to talk about being a second generation Archivette. And when you look at it, you can start to see different periods where people became involved and what those generational, differences were and how things have changed over time. And so that was another important piece to me. It's trying to choose one main person who could represent a certain time period to ensure that I wasn't, overlapping with those kinds of stories. But it was absolutely brutal. And also, I barely scratched the surface on what's in the archive. There's just so much incredible material. And I think that there hopefully are many other films to be made.
Definitely. And I know that this film was made before the pandemic, obviously. But we live kind of in a different world now where diversity, social justice, intersectionality are everyday conversations, right? And so I really appreciated seeing in your film some diversity of the lesbians there and the intersectionality. And you had mentioned to me in a previous conversation that you wish there was a little bit more, but that many of the very active women of color had already passed away. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think one thing that's incredible to me about the archive is that they don't have such a clear hierarchy, right? It's really collective decision making. Everyone has to agree on what they're doing. And from day one, they wanted it to be inclusive. So they always had women of color. They also always had different socioeconomic levels, right? And I know that's mentioned in the film that the person who donated some stamps to the archives effort in the new building got the same thank you note as someone who donated, a good amount.
I love that. I love the idea that someone who gave $60,000 or 4 stamps got the same thank you, right?
It's beautiful. And they knew that, right? They knew they didn't want to name a room after some wealthy person because it would alter that. And as a community, we're so many different things, and they really wanted to try to include that. So, when I was going to make the film, it was important to me that I tried to include those different voices. But I think the 2 women that I wish I had been able to interview that died, long before I came along were Mabel Hampton, who is mentioned in the film, and then Georgia Brooks, who I don't spend much time. There's a few photographs of Georgia, but I know she was also an incredible voice and an incredible person.
Right. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about Mabel in just a bit. I also want to ask you, because you just had mentioned you could have done a million films just about the archives and the Archivettes. For what we saw, was there any particular scene out of all the scenes in the 60 minutes that meant the most to you?
Oh, that's a great question. No one's asked me that. That's excellent. I mean, I honestly feel like the Dyke March is just such a meaningful experience. And even though it's not really a huge part of the film, you see them making the signs at the beginning and then we go back to the marches at the end. I just think that represents community in such a beautiful way. And so that was one of my favorite scenes to film. And just to be there with documenting all their conversations and their connections, it felt really incredible. And I'm excited that, the Dyke March happens every year. So I'm going to go on Saturday. And even though they're not marching as a collective, I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing and catching up with some of the Archivettes.
Oh, that's so cool. And now that it's been a couple of years, I know that Deb was, you weren't that close with her while making the film, but you and Deb are pretty close now. I mean, you have a different relationship now with her than in the beginning. Can you talk about how that relationship has evolved?
Absolutely. Deb is an incredible person. She has done so many things for so many people, led this archive. She also was like a child psychologist and worked in a school and is still like very involved in that. So she's just impacted the world in so many ways. And I think when I started making the film, she was always my main connection. I went to her and I was like, I want to make a feature. How do you feel? And, what do you think? And she took it back to the collective and they talked about it and came back to me. But she was always my sort of central touch point, would do anything she could to help, or, was incredibly supportive. And then we started doing, some film festivals together, Q&As. I ended up going to her cabin in New Hampshire over the summer with my partner, and we just kept building. And then we got to the point, which was so nice, we just got to hang out without the film. Right? Because initially, like, I'm filming her, so I was spending tons of time with her, getting to know her, and then we did the Q&As. But now we just get together, like, we'll double date. And it's so wonderful to see her and go to dinner. Or we had recently we went to the Botanic Gardens together. So it means a lot to me, that relationship and feeling that connection to her and that community.
Yeah, and I'm so inspired by her commitment. She's in her 70s and still financially kind of running the whole ship, the whole operation. There must be a little bit of, apprehension and some fear about when she's ready to move on, right? Because we want to sustain these archives. And I think that's also the question in any nonprofit, right? In any museum or any, similar type of archive situation. That must be a little conversation that's going on over there, right?
Oh, definitely. It's interesting because at some point, Joan and Deb, as the founders, realized, like, we have to have a committee, right? Like, it can't just be on us, because if we die, then this thing will die with us. So they've built that community and they've made it in a way that the next generation has gotten very involved. But I do think the financial piece is such a challenge, just because the archive always needs finances, and somehow with tape and glue and whatever, Deb always is able to make it work year in, year out. And so I don't know exactly how the next generation is going to handle that part of it, but I do think that is probably the biggest challenge in terms of, when Deb is ready to retire, what that will look like for the next set of Archivettes.
Right. Well, and it's great to see this new generation of volunteers coming up. And Megan, there were so many great moments and themes in this film. I'd like to now bring in Cayleff, our longtime supporter of the Women's Museum, activist, educator, to join in on this conversation. Now, Cayleff, your activism dates back to the 1970s, during which you said you grew up in the bar culture. And we actually heard some Archivettes talk about that in the film. So you must have seen yourself in some ways through the experience of the women in this film. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. I mean, I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of the film, is that as lesbians, we see ourselves in the experiences of the women across the generations. In the early 1970s, I was in Boston, and this is when the bars were essentially mafia-owned. And even after Stonewall in '69, by the way, that was not the first gay rebellion. The first gay rebellion was the Compton cafeteria riots in 1966 in California, but that was essentially people of color, trans and drag, and it has been sort of superseded by the Stonewall event. But one of the first things we would do when we would go into a bar, after you had to know a code through the peephole in the door, you would familiarize yourself with where's the back exit. Anybody in the military would immediately check out the bathroom to find out how big is the bathroom window. Right. If you need to get out that way. And I'll tell you something, when I lived in Houston, Texas in the mid-'80s, women in the military that were in the lesbian bars, when anybody came in who looked like they might be reps from the different military branches, they went right for the bathroom out the window. And one of the things I just used to do informally is, saunter over to the bathroom and say, okay, it's okay, okay to come out, they're gone, whatever. But I mean, that level of fear and self-consciousness and protection was something that we were always aware of.
And those stories are so important to capture and to remember, especially during a time when the visibility of what it means to be lesbian is evolving and it's changing, right? So talk to us, Cayleff, about, you've taught women's studies for decades and lesbian history for decades. How do we reconcile this moment as there's a lot of focus on the trans and non-binary community? And of course, Megan, you can chime in on this too, because it was touched upon just a little bit in the film, but how important it is for everyone to know and understand lesbian history first and foremost.
Yeah, it's a really important issue. For some people, it's a divisive issue. They feel that the lesbian experience has been overshadowed by trans and non-binary. I think that's a false distinction. I think all our stories need to be told. Every generation has and will continue to redefine ourselves. What I think the film does such a wonderful job of, you've talked about it, is the intergenerationality. There's such respect when the younger women, and in fact, a couple of them say, I don't actually identify as lesbian, I identify as queer, but I have an affinity. I want to know, I want to understand. And that to me strikes me as the most holistic approach, in the same way that I think queer elders now, I would hope, would approach trans and non-binary experiences that they have not lived and say, I need to understand, I need to learn. And so this, seeing these as sort of combative positions, I think it's a kind of horizontal hostility that's really ill-placed. We need each other as members of non-dominant communities. And so I love what the archives represents and what women's studies and LGBTQ studies represent, which is that it's not trying to have a competition about a hierarchy of oppression. It's simply saying at any given point in time, there are extremely different identities, and we need to have a full and respectful understanding of them all.
But Megan, when the archives, the Lesbian Herstory Archives, it's in the word, the title, was created many decades ago, where the community is today has evolved and it's changed and it's widened, right? So do you feel that the archives themselves have to also widen? Has there been pressure to change the title, and to be more inclusive, for example?
These are such important questions. And I just want to say, Professor Cayleff, that was the most beautiful response to that question that I have ever heard. And it is something that, we're often talking about, and I couldn't agree with you more. Leanne, for your question, the archives loves to say that even when they were naming themselves, they could have called themselves so many different things, right? This is the era of like women with a Y and an I, and, they ended up calling themselves the Lesbian Herstory Archives because they felt like that was an important word at the time, that identity. But since then, it's changed. And so Deb loves to say, if we changed our name, we'd have to change it like every 10 years because what we call ourselves just continues to change. And so the way that they look at it is that if you feel an affinity for that word lesbian, you can donate. So Maxine Wolf loves to tell this story that she was there one day and someone came and knocked on her door, and it was a trans woman saying like, well, do you take trans materials? And Maxine kind of thought about it and we're like, well, how do you feel about the word lesbian? And so the woman said, I feel affinity with that word. And so they ended up taking her materials. And I think now they will continue. They leave it up to the person who's donating to decide whether or not that's the place. But Maxine also encourages people to think about whether or not that's the best place you want your stuff. Like, would you rather have it in a trans archive? Would you rather have some of it in each? You know, like, how do you want people to find you? That's a great thing about like Audre Lorde, is that she put her stuff everywhere. So she is in the Lesbian Herstory Archive, but she's in so many other places. And so those are the kinds of considerations. In terms of widening, I think that is a big part of it. I know that there was a time where the archives did have tension around, should we be trans inclusive? Should we not? How can we go about this? But I think they've come a long way, and they definitely now are working to continue to be more inclusive. And even people who are on the coordinating committee might have different identities, might identify as non-binary. And so they are kind of leaving it up to the donator to decide whether or not that place is for them. But anyone who feels affinity with that word lesbian is welcome.
Thank you for that. You know, and this conversation will continue and evolve, right? And it's good to know that even within the Archivettes, that there has been years of talk and struggle in trying to figure things out. And I think that's life, right? That's just life, and it keeps us on our toes. You know, one thing that has also changed is the way that we document ourselves, right? So there were so many beautiful moments where, you know, that diary that was saved from Ohio, and she literally typed out, you know, the words, and then you had somebody read it, and it's just like she came alive again. And I thought to myself, like, gosh, I haven't written or typed in a diary in a long time, you know, like a physical diary. We might do something like, you know, on our phones or online. And so it's almost like that tenderness and how special that is going away now. Is that something that, you know, we should all be worried about? And this is a question to both Megan and Cayleff, as we're talking about, you know, continuing to document our history, right? When our history is like the way that we're documenting ourselves is beginning to change, and it's so digital now.
Yeah, I think it's a tremendous concern. As an historian, the work that I've been able to produce has been based on archives. And, you know, you talk about the boxes on the desks at the Lesbian Herstory Archives that, you know, whether to keep or let go, or and historians only get to look at the keep. In a digital age, so much is communicated that does not have a lasting presence. That's a tremendous loss for history. And I strongly encourage people to print out hard copies of something of importance, and also to think in terms of where to leave our own records as lesbians. In other words, we all have a responsibility, all queer people, to document our lives so that the impact of what we've done exists for future generations to see. If we don't consciously preserve it, it will be lost de facto. And that's a tragedy, because then you have people who didn't live the life talking about queer people. You have, sorry, but well-intentioned academics speculating based on, you know, incomplete versions of a whole life. It's vitally important that we continue to collect. And also, let me just say, you know, the things that are in the archives, all that ephemera, all those small things, you know, the matchbook from the lesbian club, or the ticket stub from the first time, you know, you went to the movie with your girlfriend when you were 15. This is the stuff of life. I think probably every single person watching this tonight has somewhere a little box or a folder or 14 boxes in the attic full of this type of memorabilia of where they've been. And you can pick up any one of these pieces of paper. And if recall is with us, hopefully, remember how important that night was, or that day, or that letter. And so I think this is something with the first generation that has to be aware of this in a new way, which is that to keep donating to the Lesbian Herstory Archives, or the Women's Studies Archives at San Diego State, or the Lambda Archives in San Diego, we need to make definitive decisions that we follow through on to get our stuff in the archives.
I, again, completely agree. I think also, as people are thinking about it, it doesn't have to be a different kind of effort, right? Like, you have texts, just print them. As you said, like, make a hard copy, print your photos sometimes. Just make sure that you're keeping a printed record. The archives has this come up where someone like puts, donates floppy disks or donates some old technology that's very hard to access. And they're not going to have the resources, to go back to that in 10 years and try to figure out how people can get access to whatever it is that's on that disk. So I think that it's very important to try to make sure that you're keeping a record. And it doesn't have to be maybe it's like, once a year that you take a step back and it's a good time for you to look back and reflect, but just print something, something so that we have that evidence.
Thank you so much for that. And, in watching the movie, it made me contemplate, when I pass, what are the things in my life that, like that Dave and Buster's card, right?
Yeah.
What are the things in my life that would end up in that box? And I'm curious for the both of you, I'm sure you thought about this in making the film and also watching the film. Are there things in your life that you would like to donate or that you would put in that box? I'm curious to hear what they might be.
Yeah, making this film made me think about my own mortality a lot. Of course it did, because you have the evidence. And for me, I actually have an archive. I have like these 2 really big, long boxes that have all sorts of like random physical stuff. So one thing when we're thinking about is like different ID cards from like my high school ID, my college ID. Anytime I've done research somewhere where I've had to get an ID printed out, to different awards that I've won, ribbons for things, to photos. I'd say photos are probably the biggest material that I have, but I have tried to keep other things. Even when I worked at the Washington Post, we had something called the Badass Award, and literally you would get a stuffed donkey that had a little shirt on it that said Badass. And I've hung on to that because I'm like, this is so funny, and it's a thing. So I'm keeping it, but that's the kind of ephemera that I think is easy to get lost.
Yeah. I lost my birth family when I was in my teens because they discovered I was a lesbian. And I moved to Provincetown, which is a queer mecca on the East Coast. It's actually a worldwide known queer mecca. And having that as a place to go. So the things I've kept, I was a bouncer at a club called the Ms. Room. Kept that ID. I had a townie card from the Pied Piper, which in the early 70s was still a sort of butch femme bar, but it was lesbian owned, and that was remarkable at that point because so much was still mafia owned. Letters from friends. Also, I think the film does a wonderful job showing the importance of keeping documents from different kinds of festivals and conferences. I have a program from the first Boston Women's Music Festival. I was an undergrad at UMass Amherst, where they created one of the first women's studies independent majors. So all of that is vital. And what I've done is I've returned a fair amount of this to the most appropriate place. Just before retiring from SDSU, part of our 50th anniversary celebration was to conduct a massive oral history project with founders and activist from the early days of women's studies. And I'm relieved every time I think about that, because for the 33 years I was there, I meant to do it as the historian. We finally got it done with the wonderful work of graduate students. And also, it's why I put the founding documents about the Safe Zones LGBTQ program at SDSU, which is one of the largest safe space programs in the United States. Those records are at SDSU. You have to be very, very deliberate about keeping your own history.
So on that note, because I'm thinking about my own self, and I keep my history and my family's history on YouTube, and I just wonder, are there any benefits to the digital age in collecting and keeping our stories that way versus the way that in which you are talking about with actual objects and things? Is it is it helpful for us to also save our stories digitally and share them widely in that way, or is it just gets lost in the noise? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
That depends on you and other people who are keeping things digitally. So I think it's all important. As an historian who goes through rare archives, I rely on what has been left and not filtered out. One of my great passion projects in my academic career was writing a biography of Babe Didrikson Zaharias, the athlete, three-time Olympic medalist, co-founder of the LPGA, much, much more. ESPN and the Associated Press chose her the outstanding female athlete of the 20th century. And I learned in my research that Babe was a lesbian, that she had a 6-year intimate relationship with a young golfer. But she lived from 1911 to 1950, and that part of her life is missing. So that every biography prior to mine has Babe in a heterosexual love affair, and I do believe it was a love affair, intimate love affair to begin with a male wrestler named George Zaharias. What I did, because there was no written documentation, was conducted oral histories. And I was fortunate enough to be able to contact her siblings, golf pros, early golf pros, most importantly, her female partner of 6 years. The timing was perfect because then everyone died. But during Babe's own life, she was so fearful of having her lesbianism known that she doesn't mention her partner until page 232 of a 240-page autobiography. She calls her my pal. And so this is why all of these types of sources are needed. Sometimes it takes oral histories with elders whose information and insight is about to be lost. So yeah, I don't think, bring it all.
I think
that means that archives also, and they are doing this, they have to update to accommodate new media.
Absolutely. I think the benefit is accessibility. Like if you're looking at the benefits, because if you recorded a VHS of, something, it would be only viewable if you had a copy of it. But the benefit of having YouTube or a video blog or whatever it is just that people can see it and they can look at it all the time and it's easy to access and it's there. So I do think that can be a major benefit. And also think about how much more people are discovering or who they're discovering, right? Because of the accessibility of some of these materials.
Yes. So I'm going to shift a little bit because we're almost at the 50-minute mark, and I want to make sure I get in all these questions. Who do you think this film was made for? Was it for fellow lesbians, to celebrate your herstory, and to celebrate, and to counter the erasure of so much history? Is it for allies? Who is it for?
I think when I set out to make the film, I wanted it to be for young queer people, because I wanted them just to learn about everything that came before them in the way that I was able to learn just by making this film. But in time, I've come to see that there are a lot more people that are interested in it, including just people who do archiving or historians who are interested in just seeing how this grassroots archive has functioned. So it's been very amazing to see all these different communities interested in it, not just the queer community.
Yeah, I would say it's for the human race, and it's particularly for people who have a commitment to social justice, equity, and inclusion. We don't learn the history of a multitude of people without tremendous effort going into it. So much of mainstream American K through 12, and unfortunately even college curriculum, still focuses primarily on an elite male hetero perspective, Western perspective. And so voices that encourage people to expand their idea of what's important and worthy of knowing, it just builds a much richer telling of human history.
And I'll tell you, one of my biggest takeaways was I love the scene of the older lesbians at the LHA reading poetry to younger lesbians. And I think it helped me reimagine, because when I think of lesbians, I think of, the dykes in the parade, right? Or I think of like younger people, right? I never think about women in their 80s and 90s and having a full life and still being able to talk about it. So thank you so much, Megan, for including that, because it helped me understand and reimagine, what the lesbian community looks like. And I think that's really, really important. And I agree with you, Cayleff, as someone who's not part of the LGBTQ community, but I am definitely an ally, this film moved me and touched me very, very deeply. So I appreciate you saying that. And it makes so much sense, Megan, that you made this for young queer people. And I'm sure that they love this too, just as much. With that said, both of you had mentioned in some way or another that there still needs to be there's work to be done. And I wanted to ask each of you to share briefly about what is the work that still needs to be done. And let's start with you, Megan.
Oh, wow. I just think the work will always need to be done. I think the awakening that's happened more recently has been incredible, but at the same time, we're seeing a rollback of LGBTQ rights, like this case this week that came down saying oh yeah, a Catholic adoption agency doesn't have to, have same-sex parents involved. So we're always at risk. I do think that, we've made progress, of course. I would say, especially as an academic who teaches at a very LGBTQ friendly college, my experience there is incredibly different than Esther Newton's, who taught there years ago and, felt like she couldn't come out, and then her tenure was jeopardized and went through a lot. So that's wonderful, right? I don't want to discount all the work that's been done, but I do think there are so many rights that we don't have. The trans community is at incredible risk all the time. And so what the work is, I think it's activism, I think it's legislation, and I think really just getting involved. It's easy to feel involved when you're on social media, but there is nothing more powerful than physically getting out there and doing the work, calling your senators, taking to the streets, marching, doing all of these things to try to help build support for our community.
Yeah, what needs to be done? We have to maintain the materials that we have. And again, I think the film does a terrific job showing that the relief that the younger Archivettes actually feel when there's a new volunteer okay, good, somebody's going to be here and keep this on. Before I retired from SDSU, I had to make sure there were faculty that would continue to foreground the Safe Zones program, as well as the Young Women's Studies Club at a local high school that I had worked with for 27 years. I think a lot of the work now needs to focus on inclusivity. If an archives or a program, a queer program, finds itself lacking Latinx, Black, Asian representation, get active, go into those communities and do the work that's necessary to make the group you're working with truly inclusive. If you're privileged, middle class, white, don't wait for people to come to you. You have a responsibility to go to communities, having done your own work, so that you have a degree of cultural competence and work from there. I'd also say, don't get content. As much as we've done, one of the things every year at Lavender graduation, which I used to have the honor to host at SDSU, I would talk with the hundreds of students and family and faculty that were there and say, look at all this great stuff SDSU has done. We're ranked number 8 in the nation for campus climate. We have pride housing, we have safe zones, we have LGBTQ studies, on and on and on. And I'd say to them, that's nice. Now, here's what we need to be working on. In other words, it's tempting. And I think Joan, there's a very touching scene in the film for me when Joan talks, she's in the apartment, the archives have been removed, and she's talking about that profound sense of loneliness and loss of family, because that was a world that she and Deb created that provided family, that provided community. And you've both touched on that well. But we just need to be aware there is so much work to keep doing. And if you're going to leave a project, put people in place to do the work before you leave. Mm-hmm. Really key.
Absolutely. I just wanted to say one more thing on this, which is I was talking about legislation and all these different higher level things. And that's because keeping an archive is an activist act, and I don't want people to lose sight of that. It's saying we are here and we are not going anywhere.
It's activists, and it's all run by volunteers as well. So one thing that we can all do is once the pandemic is completely lifted and it's safe to do so, is to show up, right? Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to show up. And I know that both the Lesbian Herstory Archives is always, looking for volunteers, as well as our archives here in San Diego. Cayleff, you've been involved with the Lambda archives here. They've been around since 1987. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that you can attest that they need support, both volunteers and funding for all across the board, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, when they began in 87, their founder, Jess Jessup, dubbed them the Lesbian and Gay Archives of San Diego. Later, it became the Lesbian Gay Historical Society, and later still, the Lambda Archives, because identifying the queer community as lesbian and gay is not okay anymore. That's two important aspects of the queer community, but that's certainly not it. The archives are very important. They have the Fritz Klein bisexual archives, talk about an aspect of the queer community that always gets an initial but rarely attention and programming. And the Lambda Archives does a wonderful job reaching out into K through 12 colleges and universities, San Diego Historical Society, and San Diego and Tijuana region, collecting and sharing queer history, everything we've been talking about, oral histories, ephemera, movement, activism, and the like. It's a gem.
It is a gem.
On Park Boulevard in University Heights.
It is a gem, and it's one that that if you have, for those of you who are watching from San Diego, have not been a part of, we do have a link for you on how to reach out to them, how to donate, how to volunteer, how to follow. And that's also another important thing, is to it's all about who you surround yourself with, right? So you can also follow Megan. Unfortunately, Cayleff is not on social media. She's very, very old school like that. Yep. But Megan, you have both your website, meganrossman.com. You have your own personal Instagram handle, but you also have one for the Archivettes. And we're listing that all in the chat box there. And then on top of that, the Archivettes themselves, the archives, has their own social media to follow. So lots of opportunity for us to get involved and to stay on top of things. And with that note, I'd love to wrap things up by asking both of you, and we'll start with you, Cayleff, on now that you are, after 30 plus years of your work at SDSU, you have retired, but not really retired. I know that you'll always be a part of the community because you have such an activist heart. What's next for you?
I'm deciding that as we speak. We relocated here almost exactly 1 year ago, and of course it was a dramatic and very draining year for everyone involved. My spouse and I, she's also a historian and a professor of women's studies and a past president of the Women's Museum of California. Her name is Sue Bonda. We discuss on a regular basis what it's going to be. I can tell you that Saturday we're going to a protest in a nearby Cape Cod town where the Army Corps of Engineers and the National Guard are pushing through building a machine gun range so that their military can practice. This would entail clear cutting 800 acres of trees, massive disruption to nesting wildlife, and making toxic for the second time the water supply. So, as an activist, you do what is happening locally when it's happening. We also have a couple of ideas we're kicking around for things that we would like specifically to bring to Provincetown, because it is such a queer-friendly haven. It's only in the last 3 to 5 years that we've had any kind of gay pride celebration, because every day is an affirmation of being queer. So there's lots of room to, we might think of proposing to add something to the Women's Week, which is an annual event in October. But we will be heavily involved in a number of things very, very shortly.
That's wonderful. The Archivettes actually showed at Women's Week, and I was there for a week and had such a wonderful time. In terms of what I'm working on now, I'm working on a film about Mabel Hampton and her relationship with Joan Nessel. So as I mentioned before, Mabel is this incredible woman, African-American, that came out in the 1920s. And she actually worked for Joan's family for a brief time. That's how they got connected. And then Joan ended up taking care of Mabel at the end of her life. And they recorded many, many hours of oral histories. And it's such a pleasure. I'm spending time now going through the oral histories, the photographs, and even Mabel's special collection, which she saved everything. And it's been really amazing to see all these notes from, different employers, who she cleaned their apartment, to recognition from selling war bonds during World War II, to her tax records, really, really tremendous.
Oh, that's so great. And we will be looking forward to that next film and all the work in which you do. Cayleff, thank you so much for sharing your experience, your vast experience and your thoughts, and bringing so much heart into this conversation. Thank you both. And for those of you who are joining us live, we want to thank you so much. If you enjoyed this conversation, please make sure that you watch the Archivettes. It'll be, again, available up through June 29th. And of course, we would love for you to also become members of the Women's Museum of California. We have recently gone virtual. And of course, we also would love for you to stay tuned for our in-person film festival taking place at MOPA in Balboa Park starting September 24th with an anniversary screening of A League of Their Own. So with that, I just once again want to thank everybody for being part of this conversation, and we wish you well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure.
Good night.